Early life and background. Emmanuel Macron was born on December 21, 1977, in Amiens, a city that would become an unlikely birthplace for one of France's most influential presidents. His early years were shaped by a unique blend of intellectual rigor and personal struggle, which would lay the foundation for his meteoric rise in politics. Raised in a family that valued education and ideas, Macron was immersed in a world of learning from a young age. His father, François, a doctor, and his mother, Jean-Michel, a professor, nurtured a home where intellect was cherished, yet it was his relationship with his mother, who had a particularly profound influence on him, that would ultimately shape his worldview. As a child, Emmanuel was quiet, reserved, and deeply curious. His mother, an academic who often spent hours debating philosophy and literature, gave him early exposure to the ideas that would later guide his political philosophy. But the world he knew was soon to change. When Emmanuel was just 8 years old, his family moved to Paris, where his father's work took them. This shift marked a pivotal moment in his life, signaling both a new chapter and the onset of his internal conflict. Surrounded by new faces, new opportunities, and a more dynamic cultural environment, Emmanuel was faced with the challenge of adapting to the realities of a more competitive world. He entered the prestigious Lycée La Providence in Amiens, and quickly stood out as a student of exceptional promise. Though academically gifted, his adolescent years were not without their struggles. He was an outsider in many respects, feeling disconnected from the conventional aspirations of his peers. It was during these formative years that he realized the power of education and intellect to transcend social boundaries, a lesson that would define his later political career. However, despite his academic success, he often faced moments of loneliness and isolation, a tension that would continue to bubble beneath the surface as he grew older. Emmanuel's journey through adolescence set the stage for his next big leap, his time at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. It was here that he was introduced to a broader intellectual universe, where he found himself drawn to philosophy, especially the works of Hegel and Descartes. However, it was not just his academic work that defined him. Throughout these years, he cultivated a deep sense of ambition that was fueled by a quiet, almost obsessive drive for greatness. His youthful ambition was not just about success. It was about making an indelible mark on the world around him, a desire that would later fuel his rise to power. By the time he entered the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration, (ENA), Macron's fate was sealed. The foundation of his character, intellectual, ambitious, and driven by the desire to make a significant impact, was now fully formed. But his path was not an easy one. As he stood on the cusp of greatness, he had yet to fully realize the magnitude of the challenges he would face, nor the potential he had to reshape the course of French politics. The stage was set for the next phase of his life, where his intellectual foundation would merge with the ambition to redefine the political landscape of France. Macron's entry into politics and rise to prominence. By his late 20s, Emmanuel Macron had already carved a path that few could have predicted. His early career was rooted in the world of finance and public administration, but it was his deep dissatisfaction with France's stagnant political system that ultimately pushed him toward the high-stakes world of politics. The transition from scholar to public servant was seamless in many ways, but his internal conflict had only just begun. Macron's first real taste of politics came when he joined the French public service in 2004 as an inspector at the Inspection Générale des Finances. The work was prestigious, but for someone with Macron's intellectual curiosity, it quickly felt confining. He was drawn to the complexities of government, but frustrated by the entrenched bureaucracies that seemed to stifle innovation. It was during this period that he began to craft a vision, one that would reshape not only his career but the very political landscape of France. His move into the orbit of President François Hollande in 2012 marked a critical moment in his political trajectory. Hollande, then president, appointed Macron as a special advisor on economic matters. Here, Macron's ability to navigate the delicate balance between idealism and pragmatism became evident. He was tasked with finding a middle ground between the left-wing policies of Hollande's administration and the economic reforms needed to pull France out of stagnation. Macron's ideas were unorthodox. He pushed for a blend of market-friendly reforms and pro-European policies, often clashing with the more traditional factions within the Socialist Party. Yet, his charisma and ability to bridge the divide earned him the attention of political elites and, more importantly, the trust of Hollande. But Macron was not content to simply serve as an advisor. His ambition was too great. In 2014, Hollande appointed him Minister of the Economy, a role that would give him the platform to pursue his vision more directly. As minister, Macron sought to implement sweeping reforms, including labor market changes and tax reductions for businesses. These were bold steps in a country known for its conservative approach to economic policy, and Macron's willingness to challenge the status quo made him a divisive figure. He quickly earned the reputation of a political outsider, despite his government position. His reforms were too progressive for some and too radical for others. Yet Macron remained undeterred. However, it was his decision to leave Hollande's government in 2016 that signaled his most daring move. Disillusioned by the limits of traditional party politics, he launched his own movement, La République en Marche, LREM. Macron's vision was clear, a centrist, pro-European political force that could transcend the left-right divide that had dominated French politics for decades. The formation of LREM was an act of rebellion against the political establishment, an attempt to create a space where new ideas could flourish unencumbered by the constraints of traditional party lines. Macron's political revolution was complete when he announced his candidacy for the 2017 presidential election. With no party machine behind him and few political allies, he was an outsider in every sense. But his campaign, built on promises of renewal, innovation, and unity, struck a chord with the weary electorate. Macron's rise was not just a political story, it was a cultural one, embodying the hopes and frustrations of a France longing for change. Macron's presidency and key policies. Emmanuel Macron's victory in the 2017 French presidential election was nothing short of a political revolution. At just 39 years old, he became France's youngest president, defying both the political establishment and widespread skepticism. But the journey from outsider to the Élysée Palace had only just begun. His campaign had promised change, and now, the weight of that promise hung heavy on his shoulders. The first months of Macron's presidency were a whirlwind of reforms, each more ambitious than the last. He moved swiftly to implement his vision of a modern, competitive France, one that would embrace globalization while protecting its citizens. His most notable reforms included the controversial labor market overhaul, which aimed to make France's rigid labor laws more flexible. This was no small task. The French labor force, accustomed to protectionist policies, viewed these changes as a direct challenge to their rights. Unions rallied against him, and protests erupted across the country. Macron's handling of the protests, though firm, was seen by some as a symbol of his unyielding commitment to reform. Yet, the public perception of Macron began to shift. The image of a reformist president, dedicated to progress, was now counterbalanced by a growing sense of frustration with his top-down approach to leadership. As Macron pushed forward with economic reforms, he also turned his attention to France's social welfare programs. His government proposed pension reforms that were equally ambitious but highly divisive. Critics argued that these changes would erode the safety nets of the most vulnerable citizens. The protests that followed were intense, and once again, Macron was forced to confront the delicate balance between the desire for progress and the need for social stability. The Yellow Vest protests of 2018 to 2019 became a defining moment of his presidency. What began as a grassroots movement against fuel tax hikes quickly morphed into a nationwide outcry over rising inequality, cost of living, and perceived elitism. For many, the protests were a rejection of Macron's presidency itself. They accused him of being out of touch with the struggles of ordinary French citizens, a leader who, despite his promises of inclusivity, seemed more aligned with the wealthy elite. Macron's response to the protests was measured, but the damage was done. His approval ratings plummeted as the French public, disillusioned and divided, questioned whether his reforms had truly benefited them. Despite the turmoil, Macron remained steadfast. On the international stage, he took a strong stance on European integration, advocating for a more unified and assertive Europe. His leadership during the European Union crises, including Brexit and the migration crisis, positioned him as a key player in global diplomacy. His advocacy for climate change action and his push for multilateralism further solidified his place as a progressive voice on the world stage. Yet, as his presidency continued, the central conflict of his tenure was clear. How could Macron balance his ambitious reforms with the need to maintain social cohesion? His vision for a modernized France clashed with the realities of a deeply divided society, and his legacy would ultimately be shaped by his ability, or inability, to bridge that gap. Macron's legacy and the future of France. As Emmanuel Macron's presidency moved into its later years, the central question that lingered was this: what would his legacy be? Having weathered protests, economic turbulence, and international crises, he was no longer the hopeful outsider who had promised to break from the old ways of politics. Instead, he had become a figure both admired and vilified, a modernizer whose reforms had transformed France, but whose leadership had divided the nation. Macron's push for a more integrated and powerful European Union remained one of his most defining achievements. In an era of rising nationalism and anti-EU sentiment across Europe, he stood firm as one of the strongest advocates for a united Europe. His ability to navigate the complexities of Brexit and his efforts to strengthen Europe's response to global challenges, such as climate change and security, made him a key figure